Welcome to the debate. Our focus today centers on, well, a really vital and often quite volatile boundary, the one between private moral conviction and public expression. We're tackling the resolution. Individuals and institutions should actively promote, advocate, beyond mere private belief, their religious convictions across the spheres of family, schools, government, and workplaces. Now, this discussion is fundamental because it really pits the right to free exercise and advocacy against the need to maintain institutional neutrality and protect individual autonomy, especially in a deeply pluralistic society like ours. I'll be arguing that such public promotion is not only justified, but actually socially beneficial, citing both, moral duty and the inherent human need for cultural transmission.
And I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. While I absolutely agree the freedom of private belief is sacrosanct, I'll be arguing that actively promoting those views, especially within shared common institutions, and particularly those marked by power asymmetry, predictably violates the autonomy of others. It can harm individual welfare, and I think fundamentally undermines the fair coexistence that's required for a modern, diverse polity.
Right. So my core thesis, it's really built on moral integrity. If we genuinely believe a truth has moral consequence, if it informs our understanding of human dignity, justice, purpose, then withholding that truth feels like a failure of both care and integrity. Authentic, non-coercive witness, I believe, is a moral duty. It's something owed to our conscience and, frankly, to our neighbor. And furthermore, this public religious presence, it generates measurable pro-social spillovers. We know religious adherence correlates pretty strongly with things like volunteerism, community service, charitable giving, all things that amplify social goods for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So I contend that robust pluralism actually requires active advocacy from all sides. Suppressing religious advocacy doesn't create some kind of neutral vacuum. It merely privatizes faith and maybe inadvertently privileges secular creeds as the unchallenged institutional orthodoxy. Just consider the family sphere for a moment. Parents are the primary moral educators. Age-appropriate catechesis provides children with essential meaning, identity, resilience. And we see evidence for this protective effect. Data from the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey back in 2019 suggested that religiously affiliated teens reported lower engagement in various risky behaviors. That kind of coherence and guidance, I'd argue, is a public good, not just some private indulgence.
That's a compelling argument, particularly regarding the internal logic of integrity. But I would argue that your focus on intention kind of overlooks the structural impact when these convictions cross institutional boundaries. Active advocacy in common spaces, schools, government, workplaces, it can easily translate into social coercion simply because of inherent power asymmetry. True conviction, I think we'd agree, requires intellectual freedom. Social pressure, on the other hand, it breeds conformity, which might mimic belief but lacks genuine moral grounding. Diverse societies, I believe, fundamentally require procedural neutrality in shared institutions. If an institution explicitly pushes one tradition, well, it inevitably marginalizes minorities and exponentially increases the risk of sectarian fragmentation, not to mention costly litigation. I'm focusing specifically on institutional conflict here. When teachers, managers, or say elected officials wield power, advocacy from them becomes inherently coercive. It chills dissent. We really have to look at outcome primacy. The foreseeable harms like exclusion, social pressure, the risk of retaliation, which in these settings, I argue, consistently outweigh the good intentions you cite.
Let's maybe focus immediately on the two settings where this dynamic is probably most acute: the workplace and schools. In context defined by, frankly, massive power asymmetries, where someone holds leverage over your salary, your promotion prospects, or your academic grade, consent to religious activity is simply not truly free. Even activities framed as voluntary, maybe groups sponsored by management, they can easily stigmatize non-participants. They can communicate that, well, participation is necessary for advancement or just acceptance. And this isn't just theoretical. The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, reported over 2,800 complaints of religious discrimination in U.S. workplaces back in 2018. That statistic, I think, demonstrates a predictable, structural harm that results from allowing institutional advocacy in settings where people's livelihoods are directly at stake.
Okay, your concern about structural harm is certainly legitimate. I acknowledge that. But the remedy you seem to propose, a sort of blanket suppression of public religious identity, feels excessive and maybe unnecessary. We can, and I think we should, mitigate foreseeable harms by implementing reasonable guardrails. Things like clear time, place, and manner limits, explicit opt-outs for activities, and maybe most crucially, strict anti-retaliation policies that are actually enforced by HR and administration. Institutions, actually, they can benefit significantly from visible accommodation and expression. A 2020 Harvard Business Review study, for instance, found that employees who felt free to discuss their faith were 2.25 times more likely to report higher job satisfaction. Suppressing faith expression risks creating sterile, maybe even alienating environments.
Voluntary expression and accommodation, they can enrich culture and foster a stronger sense of belonging. They don't inherently lead to the structural discrimination you fear, provided those guardrails are firmly in place.
Okay. The problem there, I think, is that you're conflating two very different things: accommodation versus advocacy. Accommodation, yes, that means allowing employees to wear religious attire or observing prayer times during breaks, making reasonable scheduling adjustments. Fine. Advocacy, though, is when a manager invites their direct reports to a Bible study or a school principal sponsors an explicitly faith-based club using school resources. That latter action is the promotion we're debating.
Okay.
And the asymmetry test, I think, is critical here. The more leverage you hold over someone, be it their pay, their grades, their career trajectory, the stricter the restraint against promotion must be. That restraint is necessary to protect the subordinate's autonomy. And in schools, well, we're dealing with a uniquely vulnerable, often captive audience. This is precisely why the Supreme Court in Engel v. Vitale back in 1962 ruled that state-sponsored prayer was unconstitutional. The court recognized that even non-denominational prayer, when led by the authority of the school, crosses the line from private belief into state endorsement and, yes, coercion. Advocacy from teachers or administrators inherently exploits that power imbalance.
I do appreciate the distinction you're drawing between accommodation and advocacy, but I have to challenge the premise that institutional engagement is purely about power. It's also about persuasion, isn't it? And participation in the public square. When we assess moral action, we have to defend the role of intent. We could perhaps apply the doctrine of double effect here, which stipulates that if the intent is genuinely to share moral good, and clear guardrails exist to ensure transparency and choice, well, then the act remains ethically justifiable, even if it carries some foreseeable negative side effects for some individuals. Furthermore, your demand for strict neutrality, it's not only practically impossible, I think, but conceptually flawed, particularly when we talk about government, which we haven't fully addressed. If we bar religious conviction from the legislative and policymaking process, we're effectively demanding that citizens strip themselves of their primary moral frameworks before they can even engage in civic life. Banning religious advocacy essentially elevates secular humanism to the state's de facto civic religion.
Well, that philosophical framework, I think, doesn't quite survive contact with the realities of, say, the workplace or the political sphere. In the realm of public policy, the doctrine of double effect seems irrelevant when the negative outcomes are so highly predictable and structurally exclusionary. For example, if a legislator motivated by religious conviction tries to restrict access to health care, the good intention to preserve a particular moral view is surely outweighed by the predictable, quantifiable harm inflicted upon the affected population. Harms tend to outweigh good intent in the civic sphere. And this pressure you mentioned, it's real. That 2019 PRRI survey found that a substantial 60% of non-religious Americans feel pressured when exposed to overt proselytizing in institutional settings. And regarding government specifically, strict neutrality isn't some rival theology designed to replace faith. It's simply a necessary procedural framework designed for coexistence. The role of public power isn't to endorse a creed, but to serve all citizens equally. Especially considering the fastest-growing group, the religiously unaffiliated, the knowns, who made up nearly 30% of the population according to Pew in 2021. For the state to function justly, its power must remain strictly neutral. Now, when religious ethics do inform legislative action, the advocate, I believe, must demonstrate that the resulting policy serves a neutral, secular public good, not just the religious mandate of one particular constituency. If we allow explicit advocacy within government operations, the almost inevitable result is the marginalization of those who don't share the dominant faith.
But by demanding that religious citizens must constantly translate their foundational moral concepts into a purely secular language, aren't you effectively disqualifying them from full civic participation on equal terms? Religious ethics have historically shaped immense public goods, things that arguably couldn't have been achieved by purely secular means. Think of the faith-driven commitment behind the abolition movement or the early stages of the civil rights era. Their faith wasn't just private motivation, it was public advocacy that shaped policy and culture. If we privatize faith entirely, we sever those critical civic roots and demand really an impossible intellectual separation. And this highlights the core tension, I think. I emphasize the freedom to express and advocate, believing that a vibrant public square requires robust contestation of all moral voices.
And I emphasize the freedom from religious coercion, particularly when that pressure is leveraged by the unique power of the state or the employer or the teacher. These two freedoms, freedom to express and freedom from imposition, they are in constant tension. We have to recognize that too much of one necessarily erodes the other. Your call for a vibrant public square is valid, absolutely, but the institutional settings we're primarily discussing here, they aren't quite the open public square. They are shared, often hierarchical, structures of dependency.
But if we strip the public sphere in our institutions of these deep moral commitments, don't we risk fracturing society entirely? I'd argue we need to maintain a sort of civic monoculture, a thin shared moral floor, perhaps informed by our historically successful religious traditions, emphasizing things like dignity, honesty, communal care. Strong communities defined by thick, identity-shaping traditions aren't enemies of diversity. They are arguably its essential stabilizing constituents. Historically, stable societies with shared dominant faith traditions have shown markedly high social trust and cohesion, which is something I think we can agree our fracturing society desperately needs right now.
Your appeal to historical cohesion is noted, but we also have to look closely at the cost. History is sadly littered with the dangers of enforced moral monocultures. They inherently suppress dissent and often lead to systemic abuses against minority or vulnerable populations. We only need to look at cases like, say, Ireland's Catholic dominance in the 20th century to see how a singular institutionally dominant culture can be weaponized against vulnerable populations and lead to profound structural harm and abuse. Procedural pluralism, I maintain, better preserves peace and cooperation in a highly diverse society like ours. We cooperate based on shared procedural rules, equal access, due process, neutrality, not necessarily on shared theological creeds.
So where do you draw the functional line then? You seem to concede some latitude in the family, which is also clearly a power asymmetric institution, but you demand strict procedural neutrality from the government. What's the structural determinant for you?
For me, the line is drawn by institutional duty and, crucially, opt-out capability. The family sphere has an inherent duty of moral formation, generally speaking, and the state doesn't typically interfere provided basic rights are protected. But the stricter the institutional duty to neutrality, and this applies most strongly to public schools and government, where attendance is often compulsory and power is highly centralized, the stronger the presumption must be against pushing specific religious views. This duty prioritizes procedural fairness and the safety of autonomy over, perhaps, forced cultural integration. It recognizes the immense, often unavoidable power that officials and teachers hold over people who cannot easily opt out without incurring significant personal costs.
I see the utility in focusing on institutional duty, yes.
but ultimately asking citizens to, in effect, privatize their deeply held convictions. It impoverishes civic life. It cedes the commons to an unexamined, maybe even unacknowledged secular orthodoxy. Thick moral narratives sustain us. Open advocacy, when rigorously combined with clear guardrails, ensuring explicit consent, protecting equality, eliminating formal coercion, can be an act of democratic contestation and community building. It strengthens, not weakens, the social fabric. We become resilient, I think, by having robust, visible moral debates.
Your desire for a resilient, vibrant moral debate is laudable, truly. But I must reiterate that the combination of institutional power plus piety is simply, well, it's combustible in shared, pluralistic spaces. In settings where attendance or dependency is effectively non-voluntary, the workplace, the school, the government office, promoting religious views predictably, and I'd argue demonstratively, harms autonomy and cohesion. A just society has to protect private advocacy and the expression of personal faith, yes, while simultaneously maintaining procedural neutrality in shared institutions. That's how diverse citizens can flourish together without fear of exclusion or discrimination.
So, the philosophical tension we've been grappling with, it really remains the heart of the matter. Should society lean more toward cultural integration, shared norms, and the necessary transmission of those values through institutional participation?
Or conversely, do we lean toward robust, coexisting pluralism, prioritizing procedural neutrality, specifically to minimize coercion and protect individual autonomy? And crucially, we have to recognize that the appropriate balance point, it probably shifts dramatically depending on the specific institutional sphere and the power dynamics inherent within it.
Indeed. And so we leave the listener to weigh that utilitarian ledger. How do the potential pro-social benefits of visible, advocated faith compare against the very real and predictable harms of institutional promotion? There is clearly much more to explore within this material.